The old piano in room 204 hadn't been tuned in 3 years. Mrs. Rodriguez knew this because she'd been asking the principal for maintenance money just as long. The keys stuck sometimes, and the middle C sounded more like a dying cat than a musical note. But it was what she had to work with. She stood at her classroom window watching kids pour out of yellow buses in the afternoon sun. Most of them ran straight to their parents' cars or walked home in chattering groups. A few dozen stayed behind for the free music program. These were the kids whose parents worked double shifts, whose families couldn't afford private lessons, whose after-school choice was either here or an empty house. The school board meeting from last week still echoed in her head. "We need to show results," the superintendent had said, tapping his pen against a thick folder of budget reports. "The district competition is in 2 months. We need a student who can really shine, something that'll make the local news." Mrs. Rodriguez had taught piano for 22 years. She'd seen plenty of talent walk through her doors, but she'd also seen how talent without resources usually ended up. The kids with potential rarely had pianos at home. They practiced on kitchen tables, humming melodies while doing homework. Meanwhile, kids from wealthy families got Steinway grands and private tutors who charged more per hour than these families made in a day. She picked up the sheet music from her desk, Chopin's Minute Waltz. The piece was beautiful, challenging, and completely unrealistic for any of her current students, but the board wanted impressive. They wanted something that sounded difficult because, in their minds, difficult meant talented. The door creaked open, and children began filtering in for practice time. There was Miguel, whose enthusiasm made up for his heavy fingers. Little Amy, who could play simple melodies but froze up the moment anyone listened. David, who had rhythm but couldn't read notes to save his life. And then there was the quiet boy who always sat in the back corner. He walked in like he did every day, backpack slung over one shoulder, shoes that had seen better years squeaking against the linoleum floor. His grandmother dropped him off each afternoon in a car that sounded like it might not make it home. The boy never said much, just found his spot and waited patiently for his turn at the piano. Mrs. Rodriguez watched him settle into his usual chair. His clothes were clean but obviously hand-me-downs. The jeans had been hemmed multiple times, creating layers of faded denim at the ankles. His t-shirt had a small hole near the collar that someone had carefully mended with thread that almost matched. She'd taught hundreds of kids over the years, and she could usually spot the ones with natural ability within the first few lessons. This boy puzzled her. He listened with an intensity that made her uncomfortable sometimes. When other kids were whispering or fidgeting, his attention never wavered. His eyes tracked her hands across the keys like he was memorizing every movement. But when his turn came to play, nothing spectacular happened. He played the assigned pieces correctly, if a bit stiffly. No obvious mistakes, but no magic either. Just careful, precise notes in the right order. She'd marked him down as a dedicated student with average talent. Nothing more. Now, staring at the Chopin piece, she felt a familiar knot in her stomach. The board wanted results, and she needed to pick someone soon. The competition was serious business. Kids came from private schools with years of expensive training. They'd performed in recital halls that cost more to rent than her entire program's yearly budget. She looked around the room again. Miguel was already at the piano, attempting a simple Bach minuet with more volume than accuracy. Amy sat nearby, humming along quietly. David was drumming rhythms on his knee with pencils, and the quiet boy sat in his corner not doing anything in particular. Just waiting. The practical choice would be Miguel. He had energy and stage presence, even if his technique needed work. Amy was too nervous for competition. David couldn't read music well enough for anything complex. That left the boy in the corner, who played correctly but safely. Mrs. Rodriguez made a decision that surprised even her. She walked over to where he sat, the Chopin sheet music in her hand. The boy looked up, his dark eyes curious but patient. "I want to give you something new to work on," she said, setting the music on the desk beside him. "It's challenging, much harder than anything we've done before." He picked up the sheet music carefully, holding it like it might dissolve in his hands. His eyes moved across the notes, and she saw his lips move slightly as he counted beats. The piece was fast, complex, with sections that required advanced technique and years of practice to master. "This is for the district competition," she continued, not entirely sure why she was doing this. "You'd have about 7 weeks to learn it. Other kids might have protested that it was too hard or asked if they could try something easier first. He just nodded once and said, "Okay." That simple response made her stomach drop. She'd essentially handed him an impossible task. The piece required skills he hadn't developed yet, practice time he couldn't get at home, and performance experience he'd never had. She was setting him up to fail, and for what? To prove to the board that her students weren't competition material? The rest of practice time passed in a blur. Kids rotated through their turns at the piano, working on scales and simple pieces while she helped with fingering and timing. But she kept glancing at the quiet boy, who had spread the Chopin music on his desk and was studying it with the same intense focus he brought to everything. When practice ended and kids started packing up, he approached her desk. The sheet music was rolled carefully in his hand. "Mrs. Rodriguez." His voice was soft, respectful. "Can I ask my grandmother to pick me up a little later tomorrow, so I can have more time to look at this?" The knot in her stomach tightened. "Of course," she said. "But remember, it's okay if this piece is too difficult. We could find something else." He shook his head. "I want to try." After he left, Mrs. Rodriguez sat alone in her classroom, wondering what she'd done. Outside, she could see him walking to his grandmother's car, the sheet music tucked safely in his backpack. The old woman smiled and ruffled his hair before he climbed into the passenger seat. She thought about calling him back tomorrow, giving him something more reasonable. Something he could actually manage in 7 weeks. Something that wouldn't end in disappointment for both of them. But something about the way he'd said, "I want to try," stopped her. Maybe it was the quiet determination in his voice, or the careful way he'd handled the music, or just the fact that he hadn't been afraid of something that should have terrified him. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at the old piano with its sticky keys and dying middle C. In 7 weeks, she'd find out if she'd made a terrible mistake, or if she'd been blind to something that had been sitting in her back corner all along. The next afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez watched through her classroom window as the quiet boy walked across the parking lot with his grandmother. The old woman moved slowly, using a wooden cane that looked like it had been carved by hand. Her grandson matched her pace without complaint, carrying both his backpack and her purse. When they reached the school entrance, she saw them talking in what sounded like Spanish. The grandmother placed her weathered hand on the boy's cheek, said something that made him smile, then kissed his forehead before turning back to her car. He arrived in the music room 15 minutes early, just as Mrs. Rodriguez was erasing scales from the whiteboard. Without saying anything, he pulled out the Chopin sheet music and spread it across his usual desk in the corner. She pretended not to watch as he traced the notes with his finger, his lips moving silently. "You can use the piano if you want," she offered. "The other kids won't be here for a while." He looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Go ahead." He approached the old upright piano like it was something precious. His fingers found the keys and he played a few gentle scales to warm up. Then he placed the sheet music on the piano's music stand and stared at it for a long moment. What happened next made Mrs. Rodriguez stop arranging folders and pay attention. Instead of attempting to play the piece, he began humming the melody. Not just the main theme, but the entire first page, complete with the complex runs and ornamentations that made the piece so challenging. He'd memorized it. In one day, "How do you know that melody?" she asked, walking closer. He looked embarrassed, like he'd been caught doing something wrong. "I listened to it online last night." "At the library." "They have computers there." "You went to the library?" "My grandmother takes me sometimes after she gets off work. I can use the computers for an hour." He paused, then added quietly, "I found a video of someone playing this piece. I watched it maybe 10 times. Mrs. Rodriguez felt something shift in her chest. Most of her students needed weeks to learn simple melodies by ear. This boy had absorbed a complex classical piece in a single evening, using a library computer after his grandmother finished what was probably a long day of cleaning offices or working in someone else's kitchen. "Can you play what you heard?" she asked. His hands moved to the keys. What came out wasn't perfect. His technique was still developing, and some of the faster passages came out choppy and uneven. But the musical understanding was there. He understood the shape of the phrases, the emotional arc of the piece. He played it like someone who had felt the music, not... Other students began arriving, and he immediately stopped playing. Miguel burst through the door with his usual energy, followed by Amy and David. The boy quietly returned to his corner seat, rolling up the sheet music as if nothing had happened. but Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't focus on the regular lesson. She kept glancing at the corner where he sat, patiently waiting his turn like always. When Miguel finished butchering a simple Mozart piece, she found herself calling the quiet boy forward instead of Amy, who was next in rotation. "Would you like to show everyone what you've been working on?" she asked. He hesitated. The other kids turned to look at him, and she could see him weighing whether to risk their attention. Finally, he nodded and walked to the piano. He placed the sheet music on the stand, took a breath, and began to play. The room changed. Miguel stopped tapping his pencil. Amy looked up from her own sheet music. David quit drumming on his knee. Even Mrs. Rodriguez found herself holding her breath. It wasn't a perfect performance. His left hand sometimes struggled to keep up with his right. A few notes came out muddy because the old piano's keys stuck. But there was something in his playing that made everyone listen, a natural musicality that couldn't be taught. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment. Then Miguel said, "Whoa, how long have you been playing piano?" "Same as you," the boy answered. "Since September. But that sounded like real piano music, like on the radio." Mrs. Rodriguez watched this exchange with growing amazement. Miguel was right. Most students spent years learning to make music that sounded like more than just notes in the right order. This boy had found that musical voice in months. After practice ended and the other kids left, she asked him to stay behind. He sat in his corner chair while she pulled up another chair beside him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Do you practice at home?" He shook his head. "We don't have a piano. How do you practice then?" He reached into his backpack and pulled out a piece of cardboard about the size of a keyboard. Someone had drawn piano keys on it with black marker, carefully measured and spaced. The white keys were labeled with note names in small, neat handwriting. "My grandmother made this for me," he said. "I practice on it every night after homework." Mrs. Rodriguez stared at the cardboard keyboard. The keys were drawn with remarkable accuracy. Whoever had made this understood piano dimensions. The black keys were positioned correctly, and even the proportions looked right. "Your grandmother knows piano? She used to play when she was young, in Mexico before she came here. She said her family had an old piano that her grandfather built himself." He traced one of the drawn keys with his finger. "She can't play anymore because her hands hurt too much. But she remembers." The story was becoming clearer. This wasn't just a boy with natural talent. This was a boy whose musical education had started at home, around a kitchen table, with a grandmother who understood music even if she could no longer play. "She helps you practice? She listens to me hum the pieces. She tells me when something doesn't sound right, or when I should make part of it softer or louder." He smiled. "She has good ears." Mrs. Rodriguez thought about her other students, most of whom had actual pianos at home, some with private lessons, parents who could afford music books and proper music stands. Yet none of them showed the musical instinct this boy demonstrated with nothing but a cardboard keyboard and his grandmother's guidance. "Would you like to stay after school more often?" she asked. "So you can have more time with the real piano?" His eyes lit up, then dimmed slightly. "I have to ask my grandmother. She works until 6 and I'm supposed to walk to the diner where she works and do homework until she's finished." "What if I talk to her? Explain that you're working on something special?" He considered this seriously. "She might say yes. She wants me to do well in school. She always says education is the most important thing." That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez did something she'd never done in 22 years of teaching. She looked up a student's home address and made a house call. The apartment building was older, with paint peeling around the windows and a front door that didn't quite close properly. She climbed 2 flights of stairs, following apartment numbers until she found the right one. The grandmother who answered the door was tiny, barely reaching Mrs. Rodriguez's shoulder, but her handshake was firm and her eyes were sharp. Behind her, the boy sat at a small kitchen table, the cardboard keyboard spread in front of him, his fingers moving silently across the drawn keys. "Mrs. Rodriguez," the grandmother said in accented but clear English, "is everything okay? Did he do something wrong?" "No," Mrs. Rodriguez said quickly. "Actually, I came to talk to you about how right he's doing everything." The grandmother invited Mrs. Rodriguez inside with the kind of hospitality that made refusing impossible. The apartment was small but spotless, with hand-crocheted doilies on every surface and the smell of beans simmering on the stove. Family photos covered one wall: weddings, graduations, babies. A lifetime of memories in mismatched frames. "Please sit," the grandmother said, gesturing to a worn but comfortable couch. "Can I get you coffee, water?" Mrs. Rodriguez accepted a cup of coffee that tasted better than anything from the teacher's lounge. The boy had put away his cardboard keyboard and was watching the conversation with curious eyes. "I came to talk about your grandson's music," Mrs. Rodriguez began. "He's exceptional." The grandmother's face lit up with pride, then quickly shifted to concern. "He's not in trouble? He practices every night, but maybe he's being too loud. The neighbors haven't said anything, but no trouble at all." Mrs. Rodriguez set down her coffee cup. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Has he had lessons before? Private instruction? Anything beyond what we do at school?" The grandmother looked puzzled. "No, just what you teach him. Why?" Mrs. Rodriguez chose her words carefully. "The piece I gave him yesterday. It's very advanced. Most students need years of training before they can even attempt it, but he learned the melody in one evening. He has always been like this with music," the grandmother said, settling into a chair across from them. "Even as a little boy, I would hum while doing housework and he would hum harmony. Perfect harmony, like he was born knowing what notes belonged together." She paused, looking at her grandson with eyes full of love and memory. "My mother had the same gift. She could hear a song on the radio and play it on our old piano within minutes. She taught me some, but I never had her ear." "But you made him the practice keyboard," Mrs. Rodriguez said. The grandmother smiled. "That was necessity, not talent. When he started asking about piano lessons, I knew we couldn't afford them. So I remembered what our piano looked like and drew what I could remember. He did the rest." Mrs. Rodriguez turned to the boy. "Show me how you practice." He spread the cardboard keyboard on the coffee table and positioned his hands above it. Then he began moving his fingers as if playing real keys. His eyes closed in concentration. Mrs. Rodriguez could almost hear the music. His hand positions were perfect. His finger movements precise and musical. "I practice the pieces Mrs. Rodriguez gives us," he explained, his fingers still moving. "But I also practice the music in my head, songs I hear on the radio, melodies my grandmother hums. Sometimes I make up new ones. You compose?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. "I don't know what that means." "Making up new music. Creating your own songs, oh?" He looked embarrassed. "Yeah, sometimes." "Is that okay?" Mrs. Rodriguez felt her heart skip. Natural composers were rare. Natural composers who could play by ear after hearing something once were almost unheard of. "It's more than okay," she said. "Would you play one of your compositions for me tomorrow? On the real piano?" His face brightened, then fell. "They're not very good. I don't know if they follow the right rules." "Music doesn't always need rules," his grandmother said gently. "The best songs come from the heart, not from books." Mrs. Rodriguez spent another hour in that small apartment learning more about this family than she'd discovered about most students in entire semesters. The boy's parents had died in a car accident when he was 4. His grandmother, who had been working as a hotel housekeeper, took custody and moved them to this smaller apartment so she could afford to raise him alone. She worked 2 jobs, mornings at the hotel, evenings at a diner, and still found time to help him with homework every night. The cardboard piano wasn't the only learning tool she'd created. There were homemade flashcards for math, a world map drawn on poster board, books from garage sales carefully repaired with tape and love. "Education is everything," she told Mrs. Rodriguez. "I came to this country with nothing. But my grandson, he can have everything if he learns enough, works hard enough. Music could be part of that education," Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully. "There are opportunities for talented students. Scholarships, competitions, special programs." The grandmother's eyes sharpened. "What kind of opportunities?" Mrs. Rodriguez explained about the district competition, about how exceptional students sometimes caught the attention of music schools or private instructors. She was careful not to promise anything, but she wanted them to understand what might be possible. "How much would these opportunities cost?" the grandmother asked. "Some of them are free. Some even provide financial help for families who need it." The boy had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. "Grandmother, you wouldn't have to work so much if I could get a scholarship." She reached over and touched his cheek. "Mijo, I work because I want to give you the best life possible. If music can help with that, then we will make music work." The next day, Mrs. Rodriguez arrived at school early and spent an hour tuning the old piano as best she could. She'd also brought something from home, a small digital recorder that she sometimes used to help students hear their mistakes. When the boy arrived for after-school practice, she was ready. "I want to record you today," she said. "Both the Chopin piece and one of your own compositions. Is that all right?" He nodded, though she could see nervousness in his eyes. "Let's start with your own music," she said. "Play me something you made up." He sat at the piano and closed his eyes for a moment. Then his hands found the keys and the room filled with the most beautiful melody Mrs. Rodriguez had heard in years. It wasn't complex like the Chopin. It was simple, pure, with a haunting quality that made her think of lullabies and longing. The boy played it with the kind of emotional understanding that usually came only with years of life experience. Yet here was this child, pouring his heart into music that felt both ancient and completely fresh. When he finished, Mrs. Rodriguez realized she had tears in her eyes. "What do you call that piece?" she asked. "I don't know. I think about my grandmother when I play it. How she hums while she cooks, how she sounds when she's tired after work but still helps me with homework." "Then let's call it Grandmother's Song," Mrs. Rodriguez suggested. He smiled at that, then turned back to the piano. "Should I play the Chopin piece now?" She nodded and pressed record again. What came out of that old, poorly tuned piano was magic. He'd been working on the piece for less than a week, but he played it like he'd known it his whole life. More than that, he played it like he understood it. Not just the notes, but the story Chopin was telling. Other teachers began appearing in the doorway. The principal, who had been walking by, stopped and listened. By the time the boy finished, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at the boy, who seemed surprised by all the attention, and made a decision that would change both their lives. "We need to enter you in more than just the district competition," she said. "There's a state-level competition for exceptional young musicians. The deadline is next week." The boy looked uncertain. "Is it harder than the district one?" "Much harder," she admitted. "But I think you're ready for much harder." That evening, she called every contact she had in the music education world. Mrs. Rodriguez spent her entire weekend making phone calls. She contacted music professors at the state university, private instructors who specialized in gifted students, and administrators at performing arts schools. Each conversation began the same way, with skepticism. "You're telling me this child has been playing for 6 months?" Dr. Williams from the university's music department sounded doubtful. "And he's ready for state competition?" "I'm telling you, he's the most naturally gifted student I've encountered in over 2 decades of teaching," Mrs. Rodriguez replied, holding her phone in one hand and the boy's recording in the other. "Would you be willing to listen to a recording?" Monday morning brought unexpected visitors to Lincoln Elementary. Dr. Williams arrived first, a tall man with silver hair and expensive-looking clothes that seemed out of place in the worn hallways. He was followed by Mrs. Patterson, a private instructor who taught children of wealthy families across the city. "I've cleared my afternoon," Dr. Williams told Mrs. Rodriguez. "If this young man is half as talented as you claim, I want to hear him myself." The boy arrived for practice unaware of the attention he'd drawn. Mrs. Rodriguez had decided not to tell him about the visitors. She wanted his playing to be natural, unaffected by nerves or pressure to impress. "Would you mind playing your grandmother's song first?" she asked casually. "I have some colleagues here who are interested in student compositions." He nodded and settled at the piano. The room fell silent as he began to play the simple, haunting melody he'd created. Dr. Williams, who had been checking his phone, stopped mid-scroll and looked up sharply. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward in her chair. When the boy finished, Dr. Williams was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's remarkably sophisticated harmonic structure for someone so young. Did you help him write it?" "He composed it entirely on his own," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "Play the Chopin piece now," she told the boy. What happened next was like watching someone discover fire. The boy's fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, and the familiar piece came alive under his touch. But halfway through, something extraordinary occurred. He began adding small variations, tiny embellishments that weren't written in the original score but fit perfectly with Chopin's style. Dr. Williams stood up from his chair. Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone and started recording. Even the principal, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped into the room. When the music ended, the silence stretched on for several heartbeats. Finally, Dr. Williams spoke. "Young man, how long did it take you to memorize this piece?" The boy looked confused by the question. "I don't know. I didn't try to memorize it. I just listened to it and played it." "You mean you learned it by ear?" "Yes, sir." Dr. Williams turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. "We need to talk privately." While the boy continued practicing with the other students, Mrs. Rodriguez stepped into the hallway with the two visitors. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Williams said, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "I've taught university students who couldn't do what that child just did. The musical maturity, the technical ability, the natural interpretation, he's operating at a level that should take years to develop." Mrs. Patterson nodded enthusiastically. "I have students who've been taking lessons since they were 4 years old, and they can't play with that kind of emotional depth." "Where has he been hiding?" Mrs. Rodriguez explained the boy's situation. The cardboard keyboard, the grandmother working 2 jobs, the complete lack of formal training beyond her after-school program. "That makes it even more remarkable," Dr. Williams said. "Natural talent this pure is incredibly rare, but talent without proper guidance and resources can be wasted. This boy needs serious musical education, and he needs it now." "What are you suggesting?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. "Full scholarship to our preparatory program," Dr. Williams said without hesitation. "Saturday classes, private lessons, access to practice rooms with quality instruments. We'll also need to get him into the state competition. I have contacts who can expedite the application process." Mrs. Patterson jumped in. "I'd like to work with him privately as well. Pro bono, of course. A student like this only comes along once in a lifetime." Mrs. Rodriguez felt excitement and worry battling in her chest. "His grandmother works 6 days a week. I'm not sure how transportation would work or if she'd even be comfortable with—" "We'll figure out the logistics," Dr. Williams interrupted. "The important thing is not to let this slip away. Musical prodigies need intensive training during critical developmental years. Wait too long and you can lose the magic." That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez made another house call. This time she brought the recordings from the afternoon, along with printed information about scholarship programs and competition opportunities. The grandmother listened to everything with the same careful attention her grandson brought to music lessons. She asked detailed questions about time commitments, transportation requirements, and what would be expected of her grandson. "This is a wonderful opportunity," she said finally, "but I need to be honest. I'm worried about my boy getting mixed up with people who have more money than we do. What if he feels bad about what we don't have?" The boy, who had been quietly doing homework at the kitchen table, looked up. "Grandmother, I don't care about what other kids have. I just want to play music." Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward. "The people I talked to today, they're not interested in your financial situation. They're interested in talent. Your grandson has something that can't be bought or taught. He has a gift. But gifts come with responsibilities," the grandmother said thoughtfully. "If we say yes to this, it changes everything. No more quiet life, no more staying invisible." She was right, and Mrs. Rodriguez knew it. Accepting these opportunities would mean publicity, attention, expectations. It would mean their small, careful world would expand dramatically. "What do you think?" the grandmother asked her grandson. He considered the question seriously, the way he approached everything. "I think about the music all the time anyway. Even when I'm doing other things, I hear songs in my head. If I could learn to play them better, maybe share them with more people, that would make me happy." The grandmother reached over and smoothed his hair. "Then we try. But we remember who we are and where we come from, yes?" "Yes, grandmother." Mrs. Rodriguez helped them fill out application forms and scholarship paperwork. She called Dr. Williams to confirm the boy's acceptance into the preparatory program. She contacted competition organizers and arranged for emergency registration fees to be waived. By the end of the week, everything was in place. Saturday classes would begin immediately. Private lessons would start the following Monday. The state competition was 6 weeks. On Friday afternoon, as the boy practiced on the old-school piano for what might be the last time as just another student, Mrs. Rodriguez reflected on how dramatically everything had changed. A month ago, she'd given him an impossible assignment expecting him to fail. Now, university professors were calling him a once-in-a-generation talent. Doors were opening that most musicians spent decades trying to unlock. But watching him play, she realized the most remarkable thing hadn't changed at all. He still approached music with the same pure joy, the same honest emotion that had first caught her attention. Success hadn't corrupted that. It had simply given it a bigger stage. The boy finished practicing and carefully rolled up his sheet music, just like always. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" he said. "Thank you for believing I could do this." She smiled, remembering her doubts from just a few weeks ago. "Thank you for proving that talent and hard work can overcome anything." The morning of the state competition arrived with unexpected snow. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at her kitchen window, watching fat flakes cover her car and worried about driving conditions. Then her phone rang. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Dr. Williams. I'm sending a car for you and the family. Weather like this, we can't take any chances." An hour later, a black sedan pulled up to the grandmother's apartment building. The boy emerged wearing the only suit he owned, a hand-me-down from a cousin that his grandmother had altered to fit. The sleeves were still a little long, but he looked dignified and serious. The drive to the state university took 2 hours through swirling snow. The boy sat quietly in the back seat, occasionally humming melodies under his breath. His grandmother held his hand and whispered encouragements in Spanish. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself more nervous than she'd ever been at her own performances. The university's concert hall was intimidating, all polished marble, floors and crystal chandeliers. Students from across the state warmed up in practice rooms, their expensive instruments gleaming under bright lights. Parents wore designer clothes and discussed their children's private conservatory training. Mrs. Rodriguez watched the boy take it. All in, the grand piano on stage that probably cost more than his grandmother made in 5 years. The professionally dressed judges, the other young performers who moved with the confidence that came from growing up in this world. "It's beautiful," he said simply, looking around the hall with wonder rather than intimidation. His grandmother squeezed his hand. "Remember, mijo, music is music. It doesn't matter if you play it in a palace or in our kitchen. What matters is what you put into it." They found their seats in the audience section. The boy's name was called 5th out of 12 competitors. Mrs. Rodriguez had suggested this timing, early enough that nerves wouldn't build too much, late enough that he could observe other performances and adjust. The first 4 students were technically proficient and well-trained. They played difficult pieces with precision and confidence. The audience applauded politely after each performance. But Mrs. Rodriguez noticed something. While the playing was correct, it felt safe, predictable. Then the announcer called, "Next, we have a young man performing Chopin's Minute Waltz. This is his first state competition." The boy walked onto the stage, his 2 long sleeves covering half his hands. In the bright stage lights, his altered suit looked even more obvious. Some people in the audience whispered to each other, and Mrs. Rodriguez caught fragments of their comments. "Who's his teacher? Never heard of Lincoln Elementary's music program. Looks like they couldn't even afford to buy him proper concert attire." Mrs. Rodriguez felt anger rising in her chest. But then she looked at the boy. He wasn't paying attention to the whispers. He was looking at the piano with the same expression he'd worn when he first saw the sheet music for this piece. Curious, respectful, ready. He adjusted the bench height, flexed his fingers once, and began to play. The first notes silenced every whisper in the hall. This wasn't the careful, controlled playing they'd heard from the previous students. This was music that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique. The boy played the familiar Chopin piece, but somehow made it sound fresh and personal. During the complex middle section that usually challenged even advanced students, his fingers moved with effortless precision. But it was more than technical skill. He played like he was telling a story, like the music meant something important to him. Mrs. Rodriguez glanced around the audience. People were leaning forward in their seats. The other student competitors, who had been chatting quietly during previous performances, were completely focused on the stage. Even the judges had stopped taking notes and were simply listening. Then something unexpected happened. Near the end of the piece, the boy did what he'd done during practice. He added his own small variations. Nothing that changed Chopin's composition, just tiny embellishments that fit perfectly with the original music. It was like he was having a conversation with the composer across centuries. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted longer than it had for any previous performance. Then the applause began. Not polite, dutiful clapping, but genuine appreciation. People stood. Mrs. Rodriguez saw tears in several people's eyes. The boy stood, bowed awkwardly like he'd been taught, and walked off stage. As he passed the other competitors waiting in the wings, she saw them looking at him with new respect. In the audience, his grandmother was crying openly. "That's my boy," she whispered. "That's my beautiful boy." The remaining performances felt anticlimactic. Each student played technically well, but none captured the audience's attention the way the boy had. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself checking the clock, eager for the competition to end so they could celebrate what felt like victory regardless of the official results. During the judges' deliberation, Dr. Williams appeared at their seats. "I need you all to come backstage," he said quietly. "There are some people who want to meet our young musician." Backstage, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Rodriguez recognized some faces from the university's music faculty, but there were others she didn't know. Well-dressed adults with serious expressions and business cards. A woman in an elegant black dress approached first. "I'm from the Regional Youth Orchestra," she said. "We'd like to offer your grandson an immediate spot in our advanced program. Full scholarship, of course." Before they could respond, a man in an expensive suit stepped forward. "I represent several private music schools. We're prepared to offer full tuition plus living expenses for accelerated training." More offers followed: summer programs, private instruction, recording opportunities. The boy listened politely but looked overwhelmed by the attention. Finally, the competition results were announced. Third place went to a girl who'd been playing since age 4. Second place to a boy from an expensive private academy. First place, the announcer said, goes to our youngest competitor, representing Lincoln Elementary School. The applause was thunderous. Mrs. Rodriguez felt her heart might burst with pride as the boy walked on stage to accept his trophy, a crystal piano that caught the stage lights and threw rainbows across the walls. But the real surprise came after the ceremony. A woman approached them, someone Mrs. Rodriguez hadn't noticed before. "I'm a talent scout for the National Youth Music Program," she said. "We provide full scholarships to the most promising young musicians in the country. This includes private instruction, performance opportunities, and eventually, college preparation at the finest conservatories." She handed them a folder thick with information. "Your grandson wouldn't just be a student in our program. Based on what I heard today, he'd be a featured performer. We're talking about opportunities that could change his entire future." That evening, back in the familiar surroundings of their small apartment, the three of them sat around the kitchen table with the trophy between them and scholarship applications spread across the surface. "It's a lot to think about," the grandmother said, looking through the materials. "So many choices, so many possibilities." The boy picked up his cardboard keyboard and traced the drawn keys with his finger. "Grandmother, do you think my parents would be proud?" She reached across the table and touched his cheek. "Mijo, they would be so proud they'd probably cry like I did today. You've taken a gift and made it into something beautiful." Mrs. Rodriguez watched this exchange and realized her role in the story was changing. She'd been his teacher. But soon he'd need instructors far more advanced than she could ever be. She'd been his advocate, but now he had professionals fighting for his attention. "What happens next?" she asked. The boy looked at his grandmother, then at Mrs. Rodriguez, then at the crystal trophy reflecting light around their humble kitchen. "Next, we keep making music," he said simply, "just on bigger stages."